Some wounds do not bleed. They simply wait for the one voice that remembers their name. The first warning came before sunrise. Every handler assigned to Kennel 7 stepped back from the reinforced gate without saying a word. Inside, a German shepherd stood perfectly still in the center of the concrete floor, his broad chest rising slowly, amber eyes fixed on every movement beyond the steel bars. He did not bark. He did not pace. Somehow, the silence unsettled everyone more than noise ever could. His name was Rex, an 8-year-old military canine whose service record had once been the pride of an elite special operations unit. Now his file carried a different label: unmanageable, unpredictable, unsafe for reassignment. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead while the scent of disinfectant drifted through the Military Veterinary Center outside Coronado, California. Morning fog still clung to the windows, turning the first rays of sunlight into pale streaks across the polished hallway. Somewhere down the corridor, a coffee machine hissed. Nurses exchanged quiet greetings, and life continued as though nothing extraordinary was about to happen. But inside Kennel 7, every eye remained on the old shepherd. A young handler carefully placed a stainless steel food bowl just inside the safety hatch before retreating. Rex never looked at the food. His ears shifted toward the sound of boots approaching from farther down the hallway. Another trainer tried speaking with calm authority. "Easy, boy." The shepherd did not move. A second voice attempted familiar commands learned in military working dog school. Nothing. The trainer lowered his eyes and quietly stepped back. Nobody wanted to admit it aloud, but everyone in the facility knew the difficult truth. Rex had refused every handler for nearly 11 months. He ignored commands, rejected trust, and withdrew farther into himself with every passing week. More than once, experienced specialists believed they had made progress, only to discover the next morning that the invisible wall around the old dog had returned even stronger than before. Behind a glass observation window, several officers reviewed paperwork spread across a conference table. No one looked comfortable. One folder rested apart from the others, its cover marked with a recommendation that no soldier, veterinarian, or handler ever wished to read. The room remained heavy with quiet resignation until the hallway door opened with a soft click. A woman in navy blue medical scrubs stepped inside, carrying nothing except a weathered canvas bag. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head, and faint lines around her steady blue eyes hinted at years spent caring for people who carried invisible scars. Emily Carter had once served as a Navy combat nurse attached to special operations teams before choosing a quieter life, helping veterans recover. She had not expected this assignment. She had certainly not expected to recognize the name written across the kennel file before she even reached the observation room. Without asking permission, Emily walked past the officers, past the anxious handlers, and stopped a few feet from the steel gate. Rex slowly lifted his head. The hallway became so still that even the humming lights seemed to disappear. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though searching through years of memories buried beneath time, grief, and silence. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she spoke two simple words no one else in the building had ever heard. "Guardian, stand easy." The old shepherd froze completely. His ears trembled. His breathing caught. And for the first time in nearly a year, tears quietly filled the eyes of the dog everyone believed had forgotten how to trust. No one inside the observation room spoke for several long seconds. Even the senior veterinarian who had spent almost 3 decades working with military dogs found himself staring through the glass without reaching for his clipboard. Rex had not wagged his tail. He had not approached the gate. Yet something far more remarkable had happened. The old shepherd had lowered his head by less than an inch, a gesture so small that most people would have missed it. Emily Carter did not. She remembered that movement from another lifetime, back when the desert wind carried sand instead of ocean mist, and every quiet signal could mean the difference between bringing everyone home or leaving someone behind. She slowly stepped away from the kennel without asking anyone to open the door. Trust, she knew, was never rebuilt by rushing toward it. Behind her, one of the handlers finally found his voice. He asked how she had known those words. Emily offered only a faint smile before resting her weathered canvas bag on a nearby bench. Inside were ordinary things that belonged to a nurse. A folded sweater, a stainless steel water bottle, A worn notebook with rounded corners. Nothing that explained why a forgotten command had reached a dog that no one else could reach. The morning continued quietly as sunlight burned away the last strands of coastal fog outside the rehabilitation center. Seagulls drifted over San Diego Bay, while distant helicopters crossed the pale blue sky, their steady rhythm blending with the soft hum of traffic along the interstate. Emily stood beside the window for a long moment before opening the old notebook. Between faded pages rested a photograph taken almost 9 years earlier. 3 figures stood beneath a canvas shelter somewhere far from home. A young German shepherd sat proudly between them, ears high, eyes bright with purpose. Beside him stood Chief Mason Brooks, tall, broad-shouldered, calm even in the still image. Standing on his other side was Emily herself, younger then, smiling without realizing how precious ordinary moments could become. She gently traced the edge of the photograph with her thumb before slipping it back into the notebook. The memories arrived quietly, never all at once. She remembered long nights treating exhausted teammates beneath dim red lights. She remembered Mason always checking on every member of the unit before thinking about himself. Most of all, she remembered the dog. Rex had never been trained to seek praise. He watched faces instead of hands. He listened to breathing instead of voices. Somehow he always sensed fear before anyone admitted feeling it. That gift had saved lives more than once, although the official reports never captured such things. A knock at the office door pulled Emily back to the present. Colonel Daniel Hayes entered carrying Rex's service file. His gray hair and steady posture reflected decades of military discipline, but his eyes revealed genuine concern. He admitted that every evaluation pointed toward retirement under heartbreaking circumstances unless a miracle happened soon. Emily accepted the folder without opening it. She already understood something the reports could not measure. Dogs remembered differently than people. They carried promises in silence long after words had faded. As she looked once more toward Kennel 7, Rex had not moved from the same spot. Yet his amber eyes no longer searched every corner of the room. They remained fixed on the hallway where Emily had disappeared, waiting with a patience that felt less like suspicion and more like recognition, as though somewhere beneath years of loneliness he had begun searching for one familiar soul who had finally found her way back. That afternoon, Emily finally opened the service file Colonel Hayes had placed in her hands, but after only a few pages, she quietly closed it again. The reports listed dates, locations, evaluations, and recommendations. They described Rex as if loyalty could be measured with checkboxes and numbered scales. None of them mentioned the way he always positioned himself between strangers and the youngest member of the team during briefings. None of them mentioned how he would rest his head beside an exhausted medic after a mission without asking for attention. Some truths never found their way into official records. They lived only inside the hearts of those who had been there. As the gentle California breeze carried the scent of salt water through an open window, Emily allowed herself to return to a spring morning nearly a decade earlier. The memory arrived with astonishing clarity. The air had been dry, the horizon painted in pale gold as the sun climbed over distant mountains. Temporary shelters stood in neat rows while generators hummed softly in the background. Young soldiers laughed over steaming cups of coffee before another day of preparation. Chief Mason Brooks walked through the camp with the steady confidence of someone who never needed to raise his voice to earn respect. Tall, broad-shouldered, with weathered hands and calm green eyes, he greeted every member of the team by name. Close beside him trotted Rex, then only 3 years old, his sable coat gleaming beneath the morning light. Unlike many working dogs, Rex rarely looked toward treats or toys. His attention remained fixed on faces, expressions, breathing, and tiny shifts in emotion that most people never noticed. Emily had been organizing medical supplies when Mason approached with the young shepherd sitting perfectly at his side. Mason smiled and introduced Rex as though introducing another member of the team instead of a military dog. He often joked that Rex understood people better than people understood themselves. Emily laughed the first time she heard it, but within weeks she realized he had been telling the truth. During long training exercises, Rex somehow knew when someone was becoming overwhelmed before any symptoms appeared. He would quietly walk closer, sit nearby, and remain completely still until the person's breathing slowed again. Nobody had taught him that. It was simply who he was. One quiet evening after the team completed another successful operation, the three of them sat outside beneath a sky crowded with brilliant stars. The desert had grown surprisingly cool, carrying the scent of dust and sage across the silent landscape. Mason removed his gloves and gently scratched behind Rex's ears while Emily wrapped fresh bandages around a blister on her own hand. There was no urgency, no fear, only rare peace. That was when Mason spoke about a verbal cue he had created during months of working alone with Rex. It was never part of official training because it had not been designed for obedience. It existed for something deeper. Whenever missions became emotionally overwhelming, Mason would quietly whisper, "Guardian, stand easy." The words meant only one thing. You are safe now. You have done enough. You do not have to carry the whole world anymore. Emily repeated the phrase once, smiling as Rex immediately relaxed against Mason's boot with a contented sigh. None of them imagined that years later those simple words would become the only bridge left connecting an aging shepherd to the life he believed he had lost forever. The memory faded as gently as evening light slipping behind distant hills, leaving Emily once again standing outside Kennel 7 with the quiet ache of years that could never be reclaimed. She understood now why the old command had reached Rex when every modern technique had failed. It had never been a command of obedience. It had been a promise. Yet one question still lingered inside her heart. What had happened after that final mission to bury such deep silence inside a dog who had once trusted the world? Colonel Daniel Hayes answered without realizing it. Later that afternoon, he invited Emily into a modest conference room overlooking the training yard. Rain clouds had begun gathering over the Pacific, turning the bright California sky into soft shades of silver. A fresh pot of coffee filled the room with its warm aroma, while folders rested neatly across the polished oak table. The colonel slid one final file toward her. This one had remained sealed because most people believed there was nothing left to learn from it. Emily slowly opened the cover. The pages described the final deployment of Chief Mason Brooks and his team. There were no dramatic headlines, only quiet facts written with military precision. The mission had ended, the team had returned, but Mason had not come back with them. Emily lowered her eyes and closed the folder for a long moment. She had attended the memorial years before, yet reading those words somehow made the loss feel new again. Colonel Hayes spoke gently. After returning home, Rex had spent nearly 6 hours refusing to leave the transport vehicle. Nobody forced him. Eventually, he stepped out on his own, but everyone noticed something had changed. He followed familiar routines, accepted food, completed health examinations, yet the joyful confidence that had once defined him had quietly disappeared. At first, the trainers believed time would heal him. Weeks became months. Rex stopped responding to handlers he had previously trusted. New voices only made him retreat farther into himself. Whenever someone approached too quickly, he would position himself in the corner of his kennel, watching every movement with painful concentration as though waiting for someone who never arrived. Veterinarians ruled out illness. Specialists tested hearing, vision, memory, and neurological function. Every result came back remarkably healthy for a dog his age. Still, nothing explained why he refused to reconnect. One experienced behaviorist concluded that Rex had simply become aggressive after losing his longtime partner. Emily gently shook her head before the colonel even finished reading the report. She had seen aggression before during years in military medicine. This was different. Aggression pushed others away. Grief waited for someone to return. There was a world of difference between the two. That evening, Emily asked permission to sit outside the kennel after visiting hours ended. She brought no leash, no training equipment, and no treats. Only a folding chair and the same worn notebook rested beside her. The hallway lights dimmed as the building settled into nighttime quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows while distant thunder rolled far out over the ocean. Rex remained inside his kennel, lying with his head resting across his front paws. For nearly an hour, neither of them moved. Emily simply breathed, allowing silence to become familiar again. Then something almost invisible happened. Rex slowly shifted closer to the gate by less than a foot. He did not ask for affection. He did not lower his guard completely. But for the first time since arriving at the rehabilitation center, he chose to move toward another living soul instead of away from one. Emily smiled through tear-filled eyes because she understood that healing had finally begun, not through force, but through the quiet language that only two wounded hearts still remembered. The following morning arrived wrapped in cool ocean air and the quiet rhythm of rainwater dripping from the eaves outside the rehabilitation center. Emily returned before sunrise carrying the same canvas bag and a small wool blanket that still smelled faintly of cedar from the cabin where she now lived alone. She found Rex awake, sitting exactly where she had left him the evening before, watching the hallway with calm, patient eyes. There was no tension in his posture this time. Instead, there was expectation. She settled into the folding chair without speaking. Minutes passed in peaceful silence until a maintenance worker pushed a large utility cart across the polished hallway. The metal wheels rattled sharply over a narrow seam in the floor. The sound lasted only a second, yet Rex reacted immediately. His ears snapped upright. Every muscle in his body stiffened. His breathing became shallow as his gaze fixed on the empty corridor beyond the gate. Emily did not move. She simply watched. A few moments later, another employee rolled an oxygen tank toward the treatment wing. Again, the hollow metallic vibration echoed through the building. Rex slowly backed away into the far corner of the kennel, not with anger, but with unmistakable fear. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. She had heard that sound before. Not here. Years ago. Somewhere far across the ocean where military transport ramps, steel cargo platforms, and rolling equipment had filled the air with the very same hollow rhythm. The realization settled gently into her mind. It was never people that frightened Rex. It was memory hiding inside ordinary sounds. Throughout the day, she quietly observed every detail. Whenever voices remained soft and the environment stayed calm, Rex rested peacefully. Yet whenever a rolling cart, a clanging latch, or the sharp echo of metal against concrete drifted through the hallway, his eyes searched desperately as though expecting someone to appear. Every report had described these moments as unpredictable behavior. Emily saw something entirely different. The old shepherd was not reliving danger. He was searching for someone who had always answered those sounds before. During the afternoon, she requested access to the storage room containing Rex's retired equipment. A civilian technician unlocked a gray cabinet that had remained untouched for years. Inside rested a weathered harness, a faded leash, an old water bowl, and a neatly folded American flag presented after Chief Mason Brooks's memorial service. Emily gently lifted the harness. The familiar scent of worn leather and desert dust had long since faded, yet one detail immediately caught her attention. Sewn into the inner lining was a tiny pocket she had completely forgotten. It was almost invisible beneath years of careful stitching. She carefully opened the flap with trembling fingers. The pocket was empty, but a faint rectangular outline remained where something small had once been carried every single day. Emily closed her eyes, trying to remember. Mason had kept something there, not because regulations required it, but because he believed every mission deserved a personal reminder of what they were fighting to return home for. She could almost hear his quiet laugh, but the memory refused to come into focus. As evening settled over the bay and golden light filtered through the windows, Emily returned the harness to its shelf. Behind her, Rex quietly approached the kennel gate once again. He lowered his nose toward the old leather before looking directly into her eyes. In that silent exchange, Emily realized the forgotten pocket was not the answer. It was only the first clue, and somewhere inside the missing piece of that memory rested the truth that had kept one faithful heart waiting for nearly 9 long years. The next morning, Emily asked Colonel Hayes for one simple favor. She did not request another behavioral assessment or additional medical records. Instead, she asked for access to the base archive where retired equipment from special operations teams was stored before being transferred to military museums. The colonel hesitated for only a moment before handing her an identification badge with temporary clearance. By mid-morning, she was walking through a quiet warehouse that smelled of old canvas, machine oil, cedar shelves, and decades of carefully preserved memories. Sunlight filtered through high windows, leaving long golden stripes across rows of sealed containers. Every box held fragments of someone's service. Every label carried a name. Emily slowly moved down the aisle until she reached one weathered crate marked with Mason Brooks's unit designation. Her hands trembled as she released the metal latch. Inside rested neatly folded uniforms, a faded field journal, an insulated coffee mug with a cracked handle, and a small olive green pouch tucked beneath the fabric. She recognized it immediately. Mason had carried it on every deployment, although he rarely allowed anyone else to open it. Emily gently unzipped the pouch and found a compass, a worn family photograph, several handwritten notes, and a compact digital voice recorder no larger than 2 fingers placed side by side. Its battery had long since died, but the recorder itself remained intact. Emily closed her eyes. Suddenly, the empty outline inside Rex's harness made perfect sense. Mason had often stored the recorder in that hidden pocket whenever missions required both hands free. He used it to leave reminders, navigation notes, and sometimes private reflections after long days that no official report could ever describe. Holding the recorder felt like holding a conversation interrupted years too soon. That afternoon, a military communications technician managed to recover the old audio files without altering their original recordings. Emily sat alone in a small listening room while soft rain tapped gently against the windows outside. The first recordings were ordinary. Mason described weather conditions, supply requests, and equipment checks with his usual calm voice. Then came lighter moments. There was laughter from teammates sharing coffee before sunrise. Someone teased Rex for stealing a baseball cap. Mason laughed and answered that the dog had better judgment than most officers. Emily smiled through tears she had not realized were forming. These were not memories preserved by history books. They were ordinary moments that proved extraordinary lives had once been quietly lived. As evening approached, she reached the final recording. Before pressing play, she noticed something unusual. The file was only 38 seconds long, yet Mason had renamed it instead of leaving the automatic date stamp. The title contained only one word: Guardian. Emily's breath caught. Across the rehabilitation center, almost as though he somehow sensed what she had found, Rex lifted his head from the kennel floor and quietly walked toward the gate again. He stared down the empty hallway, ears gently forward, waiting with the same patient hope that had survived every lonely season. Emily rested her finger above the play button, suddenly afraid that whatever waited inside those final 38 seconds would explain not only why Rex had never truly left the past, but why he had spent 9 long years refusing to let go of a promise that no one else even knew had been made. Emily rested the headphones over her ears and finally pressed the play button. For a moment, there was only the faint hiss of desert wind brushing across the recorder microphone. Then Mason's familiar voice filled the quiet room with the same calm steadiness she remembered from years before. Recording for mission log. Conditions are stable. Team morale is good. Rex has been pretending he is in charge again. A soft laugh followed, and somewhere in the background the shepherd gave a single contented bark that made Emily smile through her tears. The recording continued with ordinary observations, the kind that seemed almost precious now because they captured a life untouched by loss. Then Mason's tone changed. It became quieter, more thoughtful, as though he already sensed that some words deserved to outlive the day they were spoken. If anyone ever listens to this besides me, it probably means time has done what it always does. It keeps moving. The room around Emily disappeared. She could almost smell warm sand carried by a dry evening breeze and hear distant generators humming beneath a sky filled with stars. Mason continued, "People think a working dog follows commands because he is trained. That is only half true. He follows because he trusts. And trust is something you earn every single day." Emily lowered her head as tears slipped silently onto the notebook resting in her lap. The recording paused briefly before Mason spoke again, this time directly to the unseen future. "Emily, if you are hearing this, there is something I never wanted you to carry alone." Another gentle breath crossed the microphone. "Rex listens to me because he believes I will always come back. If one day I cannot, I need someone he already trusts to finish that promise for me." Emily closed her eyes as the meaning settled deep inside her heart. Mason's voice remained steady until the final seconds. Guardian is not his nickname. It is his purpose. When I tell him, "Guardian, stand easy," I am telling him the watch is over. I am telling him someone else has taken responsibility. If I am gone, you become that person. Not because I asked you to replace me. Nobody could. But because he already chose you long before either of us noticed. The final words arrived almost as a whisper. "Take him home, Emily. Let him rest. He has carried enough. The recording ended with a soft click. No dramatic farewell. No final speech. Only silence. Emily remained motionless for several minutes before slowly standing and carrying the recorder back across the rehabilitation center. Evening sunlight stretched through the hallway in warm golden bands, turning the polished floor into mirrors of quiet light. When she stopped outside Kennel 7, Rex was already waiting at the gate. She did not speak immediately. She simply knelt until their eyes met through the steel bars. Then, with gentle hands, she held the recorder close enough for the old shepherd to hear the last few seconds one more time. Mason's familiar voice drifted softly through the speaker. "Guardian, stand easy." Before the words had completely faded, Rex lowered himself onto the kennel floor, rested his gray muzzle across his front paws, and released the deepest, longest sigh anyone in the building had ever heard. It was not the sound of surrender. It was the sound of a faithful soldier finally believing that someone had returned to relieve him from a watch he had refused to abandon for 9 long years. By the end of the week, the rehabilitation center no longer sounded quite the same. The tension that had once settled over Kennel 7, like an invisible storm, slowly gave way to something quieter. Every morning, Emily arrived just after sunrise, carrying fresh coffee for the staff and a small blanket for Rex, although the old shepherd rarely needed it. He seemed warmer now, not because the weather had changed, but because the weight he had carried for so many years had finally begun to lift. Nobody rushed his recovery. Nobody expected miracles overnight. Instead, they celebrated the smallest victories. The first time Rex accepted a bowl of water while Emily remained beside the gate. The first time he rested peacefully through the sound of a rolling medical cart without retreating into the corner. The first afternoon he quietly placed one weathered paw against the steel door as Emily prepared to leave for the evening. Colonel Daniel Hayes watched each moment with quiet amazement. He admitted that every specialist had focused on correcting behavior when what Rex had truly needed was permission to stop guarding a promise that had already been fulfilled. One bright Saturday morning, the colonel arrived carrying a simple folder and an official document. The recommendation for permanent retirement had been approved. Rex would never return to active service, not because he had failed, but because his service had already been extraordinary. Emily read the papers slowly before signing the final adoption forms with hands that trembled just enough to reveal how much the moment meant. The staff gathered outside beneath clear California skies as the kennel door was opened without urgency or ceremony. No commands were given. No leash was pulled. Emily simply stood a few feet away with the same gentle patience she had carried from the beginning. Rex looked toward the familiar walls that had held him for nearly a year, then quietly stepped across the threshold. His gait was slower now, touched by age, yet every step carried a quiet dignity earned through years of faithful service. When he reached Emily, he leaned his head softly against her shoulder. Nobody applauded. Some moments were too sacred for noise. Even the breeze moving through the eucalyptus trees seemed to pause. Before leaving the center, Emily stopped beside a small memorial garden where veterans, handlers, and retired military dogs were remembered with engraved stones and flowering shrubs. She placed the recovered voice recorder beneath a young oak tree that had been planted in honor of Chief Mason Brooks several years earlier. She whispered a quiet thank you that only the wind could carry. Rex stood beside her, looking toward the branches overhead as sunlight shimmered through fresh green leaves. Then, without hesitation, he gently lowered himself onto the grass, closed his eyes, and rested for several peaceful minutes. It was the first time anyone there had ever seen him sleep so deeply in an unfamiliar place. As Emily watched the old shepherd breathe with calm, steady rhythm, she finally understood Mason's final request. Bringing Rex home had never been about changing where he lived. It had always been about giving him a place where duty no longer outweighed peace, where memory no longer demanded constant vigilance, and where a faithful guardian could finally discover that love, not responsibility, would be waiting for him every time he opened his eyes. 1 year slipped quietly into memory, measured not by calendars, but by ordinary mornings that once seemed impossible. Emily's small cedar cabin overlooked a peaceful stretch of coastline, where sea grass bent gently beneath the breeze and gulls circled above the waves each dawn. The scent of salt, pine, and fresh coffee greeted every sunrise, replacing the antiseptic halls and steel kennels that had defined so much of the past. Rex had grown older. Silver now covered much of his muzzle, and his stride had slowed into the unhurried rhythm of a dog who no longer believed every sound demanded his attention. Yet his amber eyes carried something they had not held for many years: quiet. Each morning, Emily opened the front door before the sun reached the horizon. Rex would step onto the weathered wooden porch, pause for a moment to feel the cool air, then settle beside the rocking chair where Emily read from Mason's faded field journal while the first light touched the ocean. They never hurried those mornings. They had learned that peace often arrived too softly for people who insisted on rushing past it. Inside the cabin, one shelf held only a few treasured things. Mason's compass rested beside the old photograph of the three companions smiling beneath a desert sky. The recovered voice recorder remained safely stored in a cedar box wrapped inside a folded American flag, no longer needed as a bridge to the past, because its final message had already reached the heart it was meant to find. Occasionally, Emily would lift the recorder into her hands without pressing play. She no longer feared forgetting Mason's voice. She heard it every time kindness overcame fear, every time patience replaced force, and every time Rex looked toward her with complete trust before closing his eyes to sleep. One cool autumn afternoon, they returned to the memorial garden outside the rehabilitation center. The young oak tree planted in Mason's honor had grown taller, its branches stretching confidently toward the bright California sky. Leaves whispered softly overhead, while sunlight danced across the engraved stone below. Emily placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base before sitting quietly on a nearby bench. Rex walked forward on his own, lowered himself beneath the shade of the tree, and rested there with peaceful dignity. There were no signs of restless searching. No anxious glances toward distant hallways. Only calm breathing and the gentle rustle of leaves carried by the wind. Colonel Daniel Hayes happened to pass through the garden that afternoon and stopped several yards away. He smiled without interrupting the silence. After a long moment, he quietly remarked that some soldiers served their country in uniform, while others continued serving long after their missions ended, simply by teaching broken hearts how to trust again. Emily nodded but said nothing. Some truths deserved gratitude instead of explanation. As evening settled across the coast, she rose from the bench and softly brushed her fingers through the gray fur behind Rex's ears. The old shepherd slowly opened his eyes, looked at her with the same unwavering devotion that had survived every trial, and waited. Emily smiled warmly before speaking the two familiar words that no longer carried sorrow, only home. "Guardian, stand easy." Rex answered with one gentle sweep of his tail before walking beside her toward the fading sunlight, leaving the memorial garden not as a lonely guardian searching for a voice that had fallen silent, but as a faithful friend who had finally discovered that love always keeps its promises, even when it arrives years later through the quiet heart of someone who remembered.